In the dead of winter 1887, kindness was a ghost. Out in the Wyoming Territory, where the wind cut like a razor and the snow buried hope, you didn't spend what little warmth you had on strangers. That's the rule. A rule Samuel Bear Morrison had lived by for 3 long, lonely years. But rules are funny things. They hold up just fine until they're tested by the sound of a child crying. And as Bear Morrison stepped off that train at Deadwood Junction, his 6'8" frame casting a shadow that ate the entire platform, he had no idea his life was about to be broken and rebuilt by 4 starving children huddled in a corner. Sometimes a man who has outrun his own demons finds himself face to face with someone else's, and sometimes saving them is the only way to save yourself. Before we get into it, I want you to do me a favor. Down in the comments, let me know the bravest thing you've ever seen someone do for a stranger. And if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear is a story of how one man's single act of kindness unraveled a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. You don't want to miss what comes next. The train whistle screamed through the Wyoming wind, a sound like tearing metal, and the whole world was painted in shades of gray and white. Deadwood Junction wasn't so much a town as it was a scar on the landscape. A single station house, a water tower, and endless miles of frozen nothing. Bear Morrison unfolded himself from the passenger car. At 42, he moved with the slow, deliberate power of a man who knew his size could solve problems or start them, and he'd had enough of starting them. The platform was slick with ice, deserted. Sensible people were inside, huddled by their fires, praying for a spring that felt a lifetime away. Bear was not a sensible man. His business in Deadwood, investigating some claim jumpers for a mining company, couldn't wait for a thaw. It was the kind of work he'd taken for 3 years now. Anything that kept him moving, anything that kept the memories at bay. He'd been a soldier once, fought at Little Bighorn, and walked away with ghosts that never stopped whispering. He'd been a husband too, and a father-to-be, until a fever stole his wife and unborn child, and buried him in a grave right alongside them. So he ran. He took jobs that let him disappear into the vast, unforgiving territory, minding his own business. Because getting involved, he'd learned, was a sucker's game. He slung his leather bag over his shoulder, his boots finding grip where smaller men would fall, and headed for the weak yellow glow of the station house. The promise of warmth was a siren's call. He was reaching for the door handle when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but years on the frontier had sharpened his hearing. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the creak of the building. It was crying, muffled, desperate, and young. It came from the corner of the station, where the shadows were deepest and the snow was piling into drifts. Every instinct screamed at him, "Go inside. It's not your problem. The world is full of other people's troubles." He'd learned that lesson in Blood and Tears. But then the sound came again, and this time he could hear it wasn't one voice. It was several trying to comfort each other, whispers of fear in the crushing cold. Against every rule he'd set for himself, Bear turned away from the door and walked toward the sound. The wind hit him full force, driving ice crystals into his face like tiny needles. He rounded the corner, and what he saw stopped his heart cold. It wasn't what he expected. Not at all. Huddled behind a stack of freight crates were 4 small figures. At first he thought they were just girls, wrapped in clothes too thin for a fall day, let alone a Wyoming blizzard. The oldest, maybe 16, had her arms wrapped around the other 3, trying to shield them, but she was shivering so hard it looked like she might shatter. But it wasn't just the cold. It was the hunger. This wasn't missing a meal hungry. This was a deep, hollow-eyed starvation that had been gnawing at them for days, maybe weeks. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes too big, their movements slow and careful, conserving every last calorie. As Bear's shadow fell over them, the oldest girl looked up. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, and they held a weary intelligence that no 16-year-old should possess. She pulled the younger ones tighter, a cornered animal protecting her cubs. "Please, mister," she said, her voice a fragile thread in the wind. "We ain't causing trouble. We'll be on our way." Bear crouched down, a motion that still left him towering over them, but seemed less threatening. He could see them clearly now. Three girls and the youngest, a little boy who couldn't be more than 6, all with the same dark hair and piercing green eyes. Siblings, no doubt about it. "What are your names?" he asked, his voice a low rumble he tried to keep gentle. The oldest girl hesitated, weighing the odds. Finally, she chose the truth. "I'm Rebecca Sullivan. This is Mary. She's 14. Catherine is 10. And this is Thomas. He just turned 6. Bear nodded, his mind racing. 4 children, well-spoken, dressed in what were once good clothes, stranded, alone, in a blizzard. "Where are your parents, Rebecca?" The question landed like a punch. Rebecca's hard-won composure shattered. Sobs ripped through her, shaking her whole body. They're dead," she whispered. "Mama died of the fever 3 weeks back. And Papa died in the mine collapse last Tuesday." The words hung in the frozen air, each one a hammer blow. "The company gave us till yesterday to be out of the house," she choked out. "We took what we could and got on the train, but we don't have anywhere to go." The story hit Bear harder than a physical blow. He'd built walls around his heart to keep this exact kind of pain out. But seeing these 4 children, seeing Rebecca's fierce, failing strength, it was like a crack forming in a dam. He looked at the little boy, Thomas. The boy's lips were tinged with blue. Hypothermia. It was setting in. They didn't have hours. They had minutes. "Have you eaten today?" Bear asked, though he already knew the answer. Rebecca shook her head. "We had a bit of bread yesterday. It's gone now." Just then, Mary, the 14-year-old, lurched forward, retching violently, but her stomach was empty. There was nothing to bring up. Bear had seen enough. The sensible thing to do was to get the station agent. Let the territory handle it. Orphanages, churches, there were systems for this, but he knew what that meant. They'd be separated, split up and scattered to the 4 winds, disappearing into a system that saw them as numbers, not a family. Rebecca, at 16, would be sent to work as a maid. The younger ones, they'd just be gone. Another set of sad stories in a territory full of them. The wind howled a final, brutal warning. He looked at the 4 faces staring up at him, at the desperate hope they were trying so hard to hide, and he made a decision that would change everything. A decision he knew was reckless, foolish, and would complicate his life in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. "You're coming with me," he said. Rebecca's eyes widened. "Sir, we can't. We don't have money to pay you." "You're not a burden," Bear interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "You're kids who need help. I'm someone who can provide it. It's that simple." But he knew it wasn't simple at all. He had no home, no plan, no experience raising children. He was a nomad, a ghost running from his own past. What could he possibly offer them? What he had was a little money and a conscience that wouldn't let him walk away and let 4 children freeze to death. Everything else, they'd have to figure it out as they went. "Gather your things," Bear said, standing up and offering a hand to Rebecca. "Let's get you fed. Let's get you warm. Then we'll figure out what's next." As the 4 Sullivan children staggered to their feet, clutching the pitifully small bundles that held everything they owned in the world, Bear Morrison took the first step into a future he never wanted. The giant who had spent 3 years running from his own ghosts was about to discover that sometimes the only way to heal your own wounds is to carry someone else's. The storm was just beginning, both outside and in the heart of the man who had just forgotten every rule he'd ever made. But as he guided 4 shivering children toward the light, for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was walking toward something, instead of running away. And that felt like progress. The Deadwood Junction station house was hardly paradise, but after the hell of the blizzard, it felt like it. A single pot-bellied stove in the center of the room glowed cherry red, throwing out a heat that barely fought back the frost creeping up the windows. The station agent, a weasel-faced man named Ezra Hoffman, looked up from his telegraph key, his expression a mixture of irritation and suspicion. "Station's closed," he snapped, not even looking at the children. "Next train's Thursday, if the tracks are clear." Bear ignored him, guiding the Sullivans toward the stove. The moment the warmth hit them, it was like watching marionettes with their strings cut. Their shoulders, hunched against the cold, finally slumped. The rigid control that had kept them standing gave way to pure, bone-deep exhaustion. They huddled together, a single organism of misery and relief. "We need food," Bear said to Hoffman. His voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that made the agent finally look up. "Hot food, whatever you've got." Hoffman's gaze flickered from Bear's imposing frame to the four pathetic children. A flicker of something that might have been pity crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Got some beans. Hardtack," he said. "Ain't running a charity, though." Bear didn't argue. He reached into his coat, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and placed a $20 gold piece on Hoffman's desk. It was more than the man made in a month. The coin glittered in the lamplight, and Hoffman's entire demeanor changed. He snatched it up like a starving dog grabbing a scrap of meat. "That'll cover it," Bear said. "Heat up what you can, and find a place for these kids to rest." Suddenly, Hoffman was all hustle and concern. He scurried off to a back room, and Bear took the chance to study the children in the better light. The full picture was devastating. Their clothes, though well-made, were threadbare and patched. Rebecca's dress had been clumsily lengthened. Thomas's coat was so big he was swimming in it, but it was their physical state that worried him most. Mary, the 14-year-old, had a grayish pallor to her skin that spoke of an illness deeper than just cold and hunger. "Rebecca," Bear said, settling his huge frame onto a bench that groaned in protest, "tell me about your father. What did he do?" Rebecca, ever watchful, positioned herself so she could see all her siblings. "He was a hard rock miner," she said, her voice steadier in the warmth. "Worked the copper mines out of Bitter Creek. Papa always said as long as a man was willing to work, he could provide." The pride in her voice was mixed with a pain so raw, it was almost a physical thing. "The fever that took your mother?" Bear asked gently. "Were others in town sick?" "The whole town," Rebecca whispered. "It started in the boarding house and just spread. Mama got it helping a neighbor with their sick baby. She knew it was a risk, but she said you can't just stand by." A woman who died helping others, leaving her own children to fend for themselves. The irony was as bitter as the wind outside. "And your father's accident?" The question broke her again. Tears streamed down her face. Catherine, the 10-year-old, silently moved to her sister's side and took her hand. "A cave-in," Rebecca managed to get out. "He and 6 other men. They were trapped. They tried to dig, but it was too late." Bear had heard 100 stories just like it. Mining was a brutal business. Companies pushed for profits, men took risks, and families paid the price. Hoffman returned with a tray. Canned beans, steaming and fragrant. Hardtack biscuits, and coffee, strong and black. To the Sullivan children, it was a king's feast. The way they ate was heartbreaking. They were ravenous, but their parents had taught them manners. They shared, made sure the youngest, Thomas, got his fill first. Rebecca watched them like a hawk, ensuring Mary was keeping the food down. As Bear watched them, the sheer, crushing reality of his decision began to sink in. This wasn't about one meal. This was about housing, clothes, medicine, school. It was about a future. Everything his own life was designed to avoid. He was a drifter, a man who owned nothing but the clothes on his back and the ghosts in his head. For 3 years, he'd told himself that attachment was a weakness, that caring for others only led to pain. The day he'd buried his wife, he'd buried that part of himself with her. But watching little Thomas carefully save a spoonful of beans, a habit learned from days of scarcity, Bear realized his independence wasn't strength, it was fear. These children didn't just need a meal. They needed what he had been running from. They needed someone to take responsibility. They needed a family. "Mr. Morrison," Rebecca's quiet voice cut through his thoughts, "we're so grateful. But we can find work. I can cook, clean. We can earn our keep." The offer, so proud and so naive, twisted something in Bear's gut. "Rebecca," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I need you to understand. This isn't about earning your keep for a few days. Everything you had is gone. Your home, your town. You don't need a job. You need a new life." For the first time since he'd met her, Rebecca's strong facade completely crumbled. The weight of it all, The deaths, the hunger, the fear, and now this stranger's blunt, terrible honesty was too much. She broke down, sobbing with a grief that had been held back for far too long. Her siblings swarmed her, a tiny huddle of shared sorrow, their small hands patting her back, trying to offer a comfort they barely understood themselves. Bear felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years, a deep, aching responsibility that was both terrifying and right. He let her cry. When the sobs finally subsided, he laid out his plan. I'm headed to Deadwood for a job. It'll take a couple of weeks. You're coming with me. You'll have a safe place to stay, food to eat, time to just be kids again. When my job is done, we'll figure out what comes next. Rebecca looked up, her green eyes filled with a fragile, desperate hope, but also with suspicion. It was a look he'd seen in cornered animals. Why? She asked. Why are you doing this for us? What do you want? It was a fair question, and the honest answer was, he didn't fully know. Part of it was just basic decency, but there was something more. These kids, in their fierce loyalty to one another, reminded him of something he thought he'd lost forever. I don't want anything from you, he said, and he was surprised to find he meant it. But maybe you can give me something I didn't know I needed, a chance to do something that matters. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the small, warm station house, a silent pact had been made. 4 orphans had found a protector, and a man running from his past had just stumbled into a future. The journey to Deadwood was only the beginning. He couldn't know it yet, but this simple act of kindness was about to lead him into the heart of a darkness far colder than any Wyoming winter. A darkness that had already killed the Sullivans' parents, and it was a darkness that was now coming for him. The dawn broke over a world buried in white. Snow was drifted halfway up the station house windows, and the temperature had dropped into a place where exposed skin would freeze solid in minutes. Behind Bear, the Sullivan children slept. It was the deep, dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted. But even in rest, the damage was clear. Mary's breathing was shallow and ragged. Thomas had developed a hacking cough that echoed in the quiet room, and Rebecca, even in sleep, kept one arm protectively stretched toward her siblings. Her watch never ended. The practical problems were piling up like the snowdrifts. Getting to Deadwood wasn't just a matter of walking. It was a 40-mile trek through mountain passes in the worst blizzard in a decade, with 4 sick, starving children. Hoffman, the station agent, emerged from his back room looking like he'd spent the night wrestling with a bottle of whiskey. No trains today, he announced, stating the obvious. Telegraph's down. Lines are buried from here to Rapid City. Could be a week. A week? They didn't have a week. In a week, Mary and Thomas would be dead. What about horses? Bear asked. Hoffman shook his head. Nothing for hire, and no one's crazy enough to ride to Deadwood in this. Bear studied the map on the wall. The main road was a death trap, winding through high passes that would be choked with snow and prone to avalanches. But his eyes caught another fainter line, a trail that most people avoided. The old mining road, Bear said, tracing it with his finger. The one that follows Beaver Creek. Hoffman scoffed. That suicide ain't been used in years. It's washed out, treacherous. You'd get lost and freeze to death before you went 5 miles. But it stays low, Bear countered. It follows the creek bed. Less chance of getting caught in a slide. More chance of falling through the ice and drowning, Hoffman shot back. It was a terrible choice. A dangerous, well-marked road, or a suicidal, forgotten trail. A soft cough made him turn. Rebecca was awake. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and sharp. Mr. Morrison, she said quietly, you're trying to get us to Deadwood. Bear nodded. The railroad's closed. We have to find another way. Rebecca's gaze fell on her 6 siblings. Mary's getting worse, isn't she? There was no point in lying. This girl had seen more of life and death than most men. Yes, Bear said. They both need a doctor. We can't get one here. Rebecca was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was stripped of all its childhood softness. It was the voice of a soldier accepting an impossible mission. Then we have to go, she said, whatever the risk. Staying here is a death sentence. Over the next hour, a desperate plan took shape. They would take the mining road. Bear would carry the younger ones when they tired. Rebecca would help with Mary. Hoffman, moved by some combination of Bear's gold and his own buried conscience, offered up his spare blankets, what little food he had, and a warning. First abandoned camp is the Copper Bell Mine, he said, pointing on the map. About 10 miles out. If you can make it there before nightfall, you might live. But as they prepared to wake the others, Bear knew there was one more thing he had to say. Rebecca, he began, struggling with the words, once we get to Deadwood, once your siblings are safe, you'll have to make decisions. You'll need a legal guardian, a permanent home. I'm not equipped for that. My help is temporary. The words landed with a quiet, devastating finality. He saw the hope in her eyes flicker and die, replaced by a weary resignation. She had dared to believe this giant of a man might be a permanent solution, and now that hope was being snatched away. I understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We're grateful for what you've done. We won't be a burden. But as she turned away, trying to hide her disappointment, Bear felt like the lowest kind of coward. He was already planning his exit, already putting walls back up around his heart. He was saving their lives, but he was still running. Let's just get to Deadwood, he said, unable to meet her eyes. We'll figure out the rest later. Waking the other children was like rousing the dead. Mary was barely conscious, her skin hot with fever. Thomas was listless, his small body racked with coughing fits. Bear fashioned a crude stretcher for Mary out of blankets and branches. She was too sick to walk a single step. As they bundled up, preparing to face the storm, Hoffman did something unexpected. He pressed a Winchester rifle and a box of shells into Bear's hands. Wolves out there, he said gruffly, and not all of them have 4 legs. A man with children needs to be ready for trouble. The first step outside was like stepping into another world, a world of pure white violence. The wind tore at them, stealing their breath, blinding them with a curtain of snow. Mary was unconscious on the stretcher within minutes. Thomas stumbled and fell with every other step, but Rebecca was a rock. She took her end of the stretcher without a word, her small frame straining against the weight, her voice a constant, low murmur of encouragement to her younger siblings. The mining road was a nightmare, a barely visible track through a forest of frozen trees, littered with hidden rocks and treacherous ice. They made maybe 3 miles in 2 hours, a cripplingly slow pace. Night was coming. The cold was deepening. Bear's mind was a frantic calculator of risk and time. The Copper Bell Mine, 10 miles, they wouldn't make it. They were going to die out here. He had taken them from the relative safety of the station and led them into a frozen grave. The weight of his failure was a physical thing, pressing down on him, heavier than the pack on his back, heavier than the child in his arms. Then, just as the last of his hope was about to be extinguished by the howling wind, Catherine, the 10-year-old, let out a cry. Look! Bear looked up, following her pointing finger. Through the swirling snow, barely visible on a distant ridge, was a thin, gray wisp. Smoke. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant shelter. It meant survival. It was the Copper Bell Mine. They were going to make it. But as a wave of relief washed over him, it was immediately followed by a cold, sharp spike of dread. An abandoned mine shouldn't have a fire. Smoke didn't just mean shelter. It meant someone was already there. And in the desolate wilds of Wyoming, strangers were rarely friends. The Copper Bell Mine wasn't just a shelter. It was a ghost, a collection of skeletal buildings sagging under the weight of the snow, their windows like hollow dead eyes. The place felt wrong, steeped in a silence that was deeper than just the muffling effect of the blizzard. But the thin ribbon of smoke was real, curling up from the chimney of the largest building, what was probably once the mine's main office and bunkhouse. Someone was inside, and people who holed up in abandoned mines during blizzards were usually running from something. The law, a posse, or something worse. Stay here, Bear whispered to Rebecca, gently lowering his end of Mary's stretcher. He took the Winchester from his shoulder, the cold steel a grim comfort in his hands. Keep the children quiet. Rebecca's green eyes were wide with exhaustion, but sharp with understanding. She nodded, her hand going to Thomas's shoulder, pulling him close. She'd grown up in these parts. She knew the score. Bear moved like a predator, using the swirling snow for cover as he approached the building. He peered through a gap in the boarded-up window. Inside, he could see the warm glow of a fire and the moving shadows of at least 3 men. Their voices were a low rumble, too indistinct to make out words, but the tone was tense. This was bad. 3 armed, desperate men against him, and 4 sick children. The odds were impossible. But then he heard Mary let out a pained whimper from the stretcher, and Thomas was seized by another violent coughing fit. They couldn't stay out here. The cold would kill them just as surely as a bullet. Sometimes the only choice is the one you don't want to make. He made a split-second decision. He went back to Rebecca and did something he never thought he'd do. He handed her the rifle. Her eyes widened in shock. She clearly never held a gun in her life. "Can you use this?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I don't know," she stammered. "Point it at whatever comes out that door that isn't me," he instructed, showing her how to work the lever action. "If they threaten the children, you don't hesitate. You shoot. You understand?" The last remnants of childhood fell away from her face, replaced by a grim, hard resolve. He felt a surge of both pride and profound sorrow. No 16-year-old should ever have to make that choice. "I'll be back," he said. "If I'm not, run." Before she could argue, he walked straight to the main door and pounded on it with his fist. A hard, authoritative knock that wasn't asking for permission. The voices inside fell silent. "Hello, the camp!" Bear bellowed, using the traditional frontier greeting. "Got sick children out here. We need shelter from the storm." The silence stretched on, thick with suspicion. Finally, a gravelly voice called back. "Who's asking?" "Name's Samuel Morrison. I'm traveling to Deadwood with 4 orphans. We're not looking for trouble, just a place to wait out the blizzard." He heard more muffled conversation, the sound of a heavy bar being lifted. The door creaked open, and Bear found himself staring at a man who looked like he'd been hewn from rock and gristle. His eyes were hard, but they held a weary intelligence, not the vacant cruelty of a common outlaw. "The name's Jack Henley," the man said, his eyes scanning Bear from head to toe. "These kids you mentioned, they really sick. Fever, cough. Haven't had a proper meal in days," Bear said. "The youngest is 6. Something shifted in Henley's gaze. A flicker of memory, maybe, of his own children long ago. He stepped aside. "Bring 'em in. We got a fire." Bear signaled to Rebecca, and the relief on her face was a physical thing. She didn't lower the rifle until he was standing beside her. The inside of the bunkhouse was a sanctuary of warmth and the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. 2 other men sat at a rough table, their faces grim. They looked like miners, hands stained with work, bodies lean and tough. But there was a 4th man sitting slightly apart. He was better dressed, his hands were soft, and he had the look of a man used to giving orders, not taking them. As Rebecca and Bear brought the children in, the 3 miners moved to help without a word. One cleared a space by the fire for Mary's stretcher. Another started heating up some broth. The 4th man, the well-dressed one, surprised Bear. He knelt by Mary, checking her pulse and listening to her breathing with a practiced, gentle touch. "Willow bark tea for the fever," he said quietly to Bear, "and we need to get fluids into all of them. They're severely dehydrated." "You a doctor?" Bear asked, surprised. "Used to be," the man said. "Army surgeon, William Garrett, at your service." As the men worked to make the children comfortable, Bear's initial tension began to ease. These weren't outlaws. They were something else, something he couldn't quite figure out. Whatever had brought them to this desolate place, it hadn't stripped them of their humanity. "Mr. Morrison," Rebecca whispered, sitting on a crate beside Mary. "Who are these men?" It was the question that had been burning in Bear's own mind. "Henley," Bear said, addressing the leader, "we're grateful for the shelter. But if you don't mind me asking, what brings you out to the Copper Bell in the middle of a blizzard?" Henley exchanged a look with the other miners. A silent conversation passed between them. "You could say we had a disagreement with our former employers," Henley said carefully, "about safety conditions and fair pay." And suddenly Bear understood. These weren't outlaws. They were union organizers, strike leaders, men who had stood up to the powerful mining companies and had been forced to flee for their lives. The companies owned the law in this territory. Men who caused trouble had a habit of disappearing. The companies have more power than the government, Henley explained, sharing a meager meal of beans with them. They buy the sheriffs, the judges. A man stands up, he gets blacklisted, or worse. So you came here to hide, Bear said. Not to hide, another miner, Santos, corrected him. To plan. There are federal investigators coming to Deadwood. Real ones, not company stooges. We've been gathering evidence, testimony from other miners, proof of the conditions that are killing men by the dozens. Bear felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked at the four sleeping children, their faces finally peaceful in the warm, safe light. The children I'm with, Bear said, his voice low. Their father died in a mine collapse at Bitter Creek. Their mother died from a fever that swept their town because there was no doctor and no medicine. The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into a deep well. He saw the understanding dawn on the miners' faces. Their fight wasn't some abstract political struggle. It was about this, about the real human cost of greed, about the families left shattered in the wake of profit. Then we're fighting for them, too, Henley said, his voice thick with emotion. As the storm raged outside, a strange and unlikely alliance was forged in that abandoned bunkhouse. A giant cowboy running from his past, 4 orphans with no future, and a handful of union men fighting for a better one. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Bear felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. But what none of them knew was that the storm outside was the least of their worries. The mining company wasn't just going to let these men get to the federal investigators. They had sent their own storm, a storm of men and guns. And it was already on their doorstep. It wasn't the wind that woke him. It was a sound so faint, so out of place, that most men would have slept right through it. The soft, metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked in the darkness outside. Bear was on his feet in a heartbeat, his own rifle in his hand. Across the room in the dying firelight, he saw that Rebecca was already awake. The Winchester he'd given her was resting in her lap, her expression grim. This girl was a survivor. She slept with one ear open, just like him. Henley and the other miners were stirring, too. They'd lived as hunted men for months. They knew the sound of approaching danger. Company men, Henley whispered, appearing at Bear's side. They must have tracked us. How many? Rebecca breathed. Bear held up 7 fingers. He'd heard movement from all sides. They were surrounded. This wasn't a patrol. This was an execution squad. Suddenly, a voice boomed out of the darkness, sharp and authoritative. This is Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison of the Wyoming Territory. We have warrants for the arrest of Jack Henley, Jim Crawford, Pete Santos, and William Garrett. Come out with your hands in the air. Bear felt the blood drain from his face. Frank Morrison, his brother, the man he hadn't spoken to in 5 years. The brother who had chosen a badge and the cold, hard letter of the law over family, over everything. The brother who believed in order above all else, even justice. Morrison? Henley hissed. If Frank Morrison is out there, this isn't just company muscle. This is official. Frank's voice came again, colder this time. You have 60 seconds to comply. Anyone resisting will be shot. Rebecca looked at Bear, her eyes wide with a question he couldn't answer. He's your brother? Unfortunately, Bear growled. The situation had just gone from bad to impossible. Frank was methodical, ruthless, and utterly inflexible. He saw the world in black and white. Lawbreakers and lawmen, and he had just branded everyone in this building a lawbreaker. But Bear knew something else about his brother. Frank might be hard, but he wasn't a monster. The presence of children, that would complicate things. It had to. Deputy Morrison, Bear called out, his own voice booming into the night. This is Samuel Morrison. I'm in here with 4 sick children. These men have been helping us survive the storm. The silence that followed was absolute. Bear could practically feel his brother's mind grinding, trying to process this impossible new variable. His long-lost, disgraced brother holed up with the very fugitives he'd been sent to capture. Sam? Frank's voice was laced with disbelief. What in God's name are you doing in there? Keeping 4 orphans from freezing to death, Bear shot back. Something you might know about if you weren't so busy taking orders from the mining companies. The jab hit its mark. Another long pause. Sam, I need you to come out. Alone. So we can talk. Henley nodded at him. Go. Maybe you can buy us some time. Bear looked at Rebecca. If you hear a single gunshot, you barricade that back door, and you don't come out. No matter what. He stepped out into the biting cold, his hands raised. Frank stood 20 feet away, flanked by his deputies. He looked older, harder than Bear remembered. The years of enforcing a harsh law having etched themselves onto his face. It's been a long time, Sam. Not long enough, Bear said. He quickly explained about the children, the storm, how Henley and his men had given them shelter and medical care. Frank listened, his expression unreadable. They're still wanted men, Sam. I have my orders. I can't just walk away because they were decent to some kids. Decent! Bear's anger flared. They saved their lives. And why are they wanted, Frank? For demanding safer minds? For asking not to be crushed in a cave-in like the father of these children was? The words hit Frank like a slap. He hadn't known. The system these men are fighting is the same system that made these kids orphans? Bear pressed, his voice low and intense. Are you on the side of the families or the companies that are bearing them? Just then, from inside the cabin, Thomas was seized by another terrible coughing fit. A small, weak, desperate sound that cut through the cold night air. Both brothers turned toward the sound, and for the first time, Bear saw a crack in Frank's rigid armor. How sick are they? Frank asked, his voice softer. Sick enough that moving them in this weather kills them, Bear said. Sick enough that they need the doctor you're here to arrest. So you tell me, Frank, what do your orders say about sentencing children to death? Frank was trapped. His orders were absolute. But his conscience, a thing Bear thought he'd lost long ago, was stirring. There might be a way, Frank said finally. I guarantee them a fair trial, protection from company interference, and I'll provide an escort to get the children to a doctor in Deadwood. But they have to surrender. Now. It's the only way. It was a devil's bargain, trusting the same system that had failed the Sullivans, that had issued these warrants in the first place. But it was better than a gunfight. I need to talk to them, Bear said. 10 minutes, Frank snapped. Then we're coming in. As Bear turned to go back inside, he knew everything rested on this one decision, but he had a terrible sinking feeling that they were all missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. They weren't just fighting a corrupt company, they were fighting something far bigger and far more evil. And Dr. Garrett, the quiet army surgeon, was the one who held the key. Bear stepped back into the tense, fire-lit cabin, and 5 pairs of eyes locked onto him. 10 minutes, he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. He's offering a deal. Surrender, and he guarantees a fair trial and safe passage to Deadwood for the children. Fair trial? Santos scoffed. In a territory owned by the mining companies? That's a death sentence. Your brother might mean well, Sam, Henley said grimly, but he's just one cog in a machine that's designed to crush men like us. As they argued, their voices low and urgent, Dr. Garrett, who had been tending to a delirious Mary, finally spoke. His voice cut through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. There's something you all need to know, he said, something I haven't told anyone. Every head turned toward him. In the flickering light, his face was a mask of grim purpose. I wasn't just fired from the Homestake mine for complaining about safety, he continued, his voice dropping. I was fired because I found proof of something much, much worse. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the small room. It's not just the cave-ins. It's not just the equipment failures. They're poisoning them. Deliberately. A stunned silence fell over the room. The companies are using a mercury amalgamation process to extract ore, Garrett explained, his voice shaking with a fury he'd clearly suppressed for a long time. It's cheap, it's fast, and it's contaminating the water supply for miles around every mine. The fevers sweeping through the mining camps, the sicknesses. It's not a plague. It's mercury poisoning. Rebecca's face went white. "My mother," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The fever that killed her. The whole town was sick." "Mercury poisoning mimics the symptoms of many diseases," Garrett confirmed, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful pity. "I'm so sorry, child. Your parents weren't killed by an accident and a disease. They were murdered by a balance sheet." The revelation was a bomb that vaporized everything they thought they were fighting for. This wasn't about wages. This was about systematic, cold-blooded mass murder for profit. The rage that filled Bear was a cold, silent thing. He looked at the sick children by the fire, their small bodies struggling against a poison they never knew they were drinking. "Do you have proof?" Henley asked, his voice a low growl. Garrett nodded toward his leather satchel. "Medical records, water analysis reports, and this." He pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Internal company memos discussing acceptable casualty rates. They knew. They've known for years. They did the math and decided it was cheaper to let people die than to use safer methods." Suddenly, Frank's ultimatum seemed like a cruel joke. Surrendering meant this evidence would be buried forever. The company would win, and thousands more would die. "Then we don't surrender," Santos said, his hand tightening on his rifle. "We fight." But Bear's mind was racing, fitting the pieces together. His brother wasn't a villain. He was a pawn, an honorable man being used to protect murderers. "There's another way," Bear said, a desperate, impossible plan forming in his mind. "We don't refuse his deal. We accept it, but we change the terms." He turned to the group. "My brother believes in evidence. He believes in the law. He thinks he's arresting criminals. What if we can prove to him that he's protecting them?" "It's a hell of a risk," Crawford muttered. "What if he's in on it?" "He's not," Bear said, with a certainty that surprised even himself. "He's a lot of things, but he's not dirty. If he sees that proof, he won't be able to ignore it." Just then, Thomas was racked by another coughing fit, and Mary cried out in her fever sleep. Their small, suffering bodies were a ticking clock. "Time's up," Frank's voice called from the darkness. Henley looked at Garrett's satchel, then at the children, then at Bear. He made a decision. "We try it your way, Sam, but Garrett keeps that evidence on him. If this goes south, he runs. That proof has to get out." Bear opened the door and stepped back out into the night, his hands raised. Frank's rifle was leveled at his chest. "We're coming out," Bear said, "but you need to see something first. You need to see why the men you're arresting aren't the criminals. They're the witnesses." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Witnesses to what, Sam?" "To mass murder," Bear said, his voice ringing with conviction in the cold, clear air. "The murder of these children's parents, and hundreds of others, and we have the proof." He saw the flicker of doubt in his brother's eyes, the professional certainty warring with the horrifying possibility that Sam was telling the truth. "Show me," Frank said, his voice barely a whisper. "Show me the evidence, and you'd better pray to God you're not lying to me, because if this is a trick, I'll be the one to put you down." As Dr. Garrett stepped out of the cabin, clutching his satchel of truth like a holy relic, Bear knew this was it. The next few minutes would either turn his brother into their greatest ally or their most dangerous enemy. The fate of hundreds of people and the future of 4 orphan children rested on the contents of that leather bag. Under the harsh glare of a lantern on a rough wooden crate set between 2 opposing forces, Dr. Garrett laid out the story of a crime so vast it was almost incomprehensible. He spread the documents out one by one. Medical charts showing identical, horrifying symptoms appearing in community after community. Water sample analyses with numbers that scream poison. And then, the company memos. Frank Morrison read them, his face growing paler with every line. He was a lawman. He'd seen the worst of humanity. But this was different. This wasn't passion or greed leading to a single violent act. This was cold, calculated, industrial-scale murder. One of his deputies, a young man named Jenkins, leaned in to look. His face went slack with horror. "My God," Jenkins whispered. "My wife, she's been sick for months. The doctor in Rapid City said it was just her constitution." He looked at Garrett, his eyes pleading. "These symptoms, the fatigue, the tremors. Classic signs of chronic mercury exposure, Garrett confirmed gently. Does your family live downstream from a mining operation? Jenkins' rifle clattered to the frozen ground. 3 years, he choked out. Our baby boy. He was born sickly. The doctors never knew why. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His own family was being poisoned. He was a pawn in a game that was killing his wife and child. Frank looked up from the papers, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes burned with a cold fury Bear hadn't seen since they were boys. How many? He asked Garrett. My conservative estimate, Garrett said, at least 600 dead, thousands more slowly dying. And the company, the territorial government, they've been covering it up. Just then, Rebecca stepped out of the cabin. She was holding a single, folded letter. Deputy Morrison, she said, her voice clear and strong, I think you need to see this too. She handed him the letter. It bore the official seal of the territorial governor's office. It was addressed to her father, Daniel Sullivan. It was dated the day before he died in the accidental mine collapse. The letter was a direct order from the governor, telling her father to cease all attempts to organize miners for water safety testing, or he would be arrested for sedition. It was the smoking gun. Proof of a cover-up that went all the way to the top. Frank recognized the governor's signature. He recognized the seal. He had been taking orders from the very men who were orchestrating this massacre. His entire career, his entire belief in the system he served, shattered in that single moment. The warrants for these men, Bear said quietly, driving the point home, they weren't about justice, Frank. They were about silencing the last people who could expose the truth. Frank's hand went to the badge on his chest, his face a canvas of betrayal and dawning horror. The orders came from Marshal Davidson himself, he whispered as if to himself. Davidson's name is all over the company's payment ledgers, Garrett said, producing another document. $500 a month for the last 3 years. Your boss isn't a lawman, deputy. He's a paid executioner. The world had been turned upside down. The good guys were the fugitives. The bad guys were the ones who had sent him here. What am I supposed to do? Frank asked, his voice hollow. If the whole territorial government is corrupt, who do I take this to? The federal investigators in Deadwood, Henley said, stepping forward. That's been our goal all along, to get this evidence to someone who can't be bought. A cry from inside the cabin jolted them back to the present. Mary was convulsing, her small body seized by the fever. Garrett rushed inside, shouting for boiled water and clean cloths. The abstract debate about justice had just collided with the brutal reality of a dying child. Rebecca looked at Frank, her eyes blazing. Deputy, if you arrest Dr. Garrett, my sister dies. Right here. Are your orders more important than her life? Frank stared at the 16-year-old girl, who had more courage than most men he knew. He looked at his brother, who had chosen to get involved. He looked at his own deputy, whose family was being poisoned. He had spent his life following orders. He had believed that was the definition of honor. But he saw now that he had been following the orders of monsters. He made a decision. It was the end of his career. It was probably treason. It was the right thing to do. There's another way, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority that had nothing to do with his badge. I am placing these men under my official custody as ordered. Henley and his men tensed, ready for a trick. My orders are to transport them to territorial headquarters, Frank continued, but my orders don't specify a route. I've decided the safest route is through Deadwood, where they will remain in my custody while Dr. Garrett provides critical medical care to these sick children. And while they are in my custody, we will all be presenting this evidence to the federal investigators. Together. It was a brilliant, dangerous gambit, using the letter of the law to defy its spirit. What guarantee do we have that you won't just turn us over? Henley challenged. In response, Frank did something that stunned everyone. He unpinned the silver star from his chest and tossed it onto the crate with the damning evidence. That's your guarantee, he said. Right now, I'm not a lawman. I'm just a man choosing a side, and I'm choosing this one. For the first time in 5 years, Bear felt a surge of pride for his brother. The rigid, dogmatic lawman was gone. In his place was the man he remembered from their childhood, a man who knew the difference between what was legal and what was right. All right, Bear said. We ride for Deadwood, together. As they prepared for the journey, little Thomas, weak but resolute, walked up to Frank. Are you going to help us now? The 6-year-old asked, his voice raspy from coughing. Frank knelt down, his face softening. Yes, son, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We're all going to help each other. The alliance was forged. A fugitive lawman, a giant with a broken heart, a renegade doctor, 3 Union men, and 4 orphan children. An army of outcasts against the most powerful forces in the territory. Their journey to Deadwood was no longer a flight for survival. It was a march to war. The road to Deadwood was a gauntlet. They knew Marshal Davidson wouldn't just let them go. When Frank failed to report in, Davidson would know the plan had gone wrong. He wouldn't send more lawmen. He would send assassins. They traveled fast, a strange procession of wounded and weary protectors. Bear and Henley took turns carrying Mary's stretcher, while one of Frank's deputies carried Thomas, who was now too weak to walk. Rebecca and Catherine walked alongside, their faces set with a grim determination that made them look far older than their years. It was Jenkins, the young deputy, who spotted them first. He was scanning their back trail with a pair of field glasses. Riders, he said, his voice tight. 8 of them, moving fast. Bear looked. They were still distant specks, but they moved with a disciplined, military precision. Those aren't deputies, Frank said, his face grim. Those are Davidson's special problem solvers. Hired guns with badges to make their kills look legal. They were being hunted, and they couldn't outrun them, not with the children. There, Frank said, pointing to a rocky outcropping 200 yards ahead. We make our stand there. It's our only chance. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic activity. Frank positioned his men, his years of training taking over. Bear and the miners found cover, their rifles ready. Garrett, Rebecca, and Catherine huddled with Mary and Thomas behind the largest boulder, creating a small, fragile sanctuary in the heart of the coming storm. Rebecca, Bear said, his voice low, if this goes bad, you take your siblings and you run. North, don't stop. Don't look back. Just get to Deadwood. Rebecca looked him square in the eye, her jaw set. We're not leaving you, she said. We're a family. We stay together. Before he could argue, the riders were upon them. They fanned out, their leader a lean, cruel-looking man with dead eyes shouting orders. They're in the rocks! Flush them out! The world exploded in gunfire and chaos, but these weren't just fugitives fighting for their lives anymore. They were men fighting for a cause, for justice. Jenkins fought with the fury of a man defending his own poisoned family. Frank fought to atone for the years he'd spent serving a lie. Henley and his men fought for every miner who had ever died in the dark. And Bear fought for the 4 children huddled behind him. He fought with a cold, protective rage he hadn't felt in years. Every shot he fired was for them, for their lost parents, for their stolen future. The fight was brutal and short. The assassins were professionals, but they were mercenaries. They were fighting for money. Bear's alliance was fighting for something more. When the dust settled, 3 of Davidson's men lay dead. The rest were in full retreat, galloping back the way they came. They had won the battle, but the victory was short-lived. Thomas is hit! Rebecca's scream cut through the sudden silence. Bear's heart seized. He scrambled over the rocks to where the children were hidden. Thomas was pale, his eyes wide with shock. A dark red stain was spreading across his small shoulder. A stray bullet, a ricochet, had found him. It's not deep, Garrett said after a quick examination, his hands already working to bandage the wound. But he's lost blood. He's going into shock. We have to get him to a real doctor. Now. The gunfight had cost them their most precious resource, time. We push for Deadwood, Frank commanded, his face a grim mask. No stops, no rest. We get these kids to safety, or we die trying. The final leg of the journey was a desperate, agonizing race. They pushed themselves to the breaking point, driven by the sight of Thomas's pale face and Mary's shallow breathing. As they finally crested the last ridge and the rough, bustling town of Deadwood came into view below them, a wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over Bear. They had made it. But their relief was instantly shattered by what they saw in the center of town. Parked in front of the federal marshal's office was a buggy, and standing beside it, talking animatedly with a group of well-dressed men, was Territorial Marshal Davidson himself. He had beaten them there. He wasn't just sending assassins anymore. He was here in person to spin his lies, to discredit them, to poison the well before they could even present their evidence. Their race wasn't over. It had just entered its final, most dangerous lap. They had to get to the federal investigators before Davidson could bury the truth forever. The sight of their ragged, blood-stained group marching down the main street of Deadwood brought the bustling town to a standstill. Miners, shopkeepers, and gamblers stopped what they were doing and stared at the strange procession. A giant of a man and a grim-faced lawman leading a group of armed men carrying two stretchers with deathly ill children. "There," Frank said, pointing to a large, newly built structure, the medical center, Dr. Harper. As they approached, a woman in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and prematurely gray hair emerged. She took one look at Mary and Thomas, and her face set into a mask of professional focus. "Bring them inside, now," she commanded her staff, her hands already examining Thomas. "This boy has pneumonia and, my God, are those the signs of mercury poisoning?" Garrett stepped forward. "Dr. Harper, I presume. I'm Dr. William Garrett. And yes, these children and hundreds of others are victims of a corporate conspiracy to commit mass murder." He handed her his satchel. "And we have the proof." Just then, Marshal Davidson, alerted to their arrival, came striding toward them, his face a thundercloud of fury. He was flanked by two of his deputies. "Frank," he bellowed, "what is the meaning of this? You were ordered to arrest these fugitives, not consort with them." Frank stepped forward, positioning himself between Davidson and the children. He had taken his badge back, and it now gleamed on his chest, a symbol not of the territory, but of a truer law. "I'm upholding my oath, Marshal," Frank said, his voice ringing with a conviction that made the gathering crowd murmur. "My oath to protect the innocent, something you seem to have forgotten." "These men are criminal," Davidson snarled. "No," Frank retorted, his voice rising so everyone on the street could hear. "The criminals are the men who have been poisoning the water of this territory for years. The men who have been murdering families for profit. The men you have been protecting." From the door of the marshal's office, another man emerged. He was older, with a calm, authoritative demeanor. Agent Marcus Thompson, the lead federal investigator. "Marshal Davidson," Thompson said, his voice neutral but laced with steel. "Perhaps you'd care to explain these allegations." "They're lies," Davidson sputtered. "Fabrications by anarchists and a disgraced doctor." "Then you won't mind if we examine their evidence," Thompson said, his eyes fixed on Garrett's satchel. What followed took place not in an office, but in the court of public opinion, right in the middle of Deadwood's Main Street. Dr. Garrett laid out the documents on an overturned wagon bed. He told the story of the poison, the cover-up, the murders. Dr. Harper, after a quick look at the medical files, confirmed his diagnosis, her voice trembling with rage as she described the effects of mercury on a child's body. The miners and townspeople who had gathered around listened, their faces shifting from curiosity to shock, and then to a slow, rising fury. They had all heard the stories, the strange sicknesses, the babies born weak, the families that just wasted away. Then Rebecca Sullivan stepped forward. In her hand was the governor's letter to her father. "My father tried to warn people," she said, her voice clear and unbroken. "The day before he was killed in a mine accident, he got this letter from the governor, telling him to be silent. They didn't just let my parents die. They murdered them because my father knew the truth." She handed the letter to Agent Thompson. The crowd erupted. This wasn't some abstract crime anymore. It was personal. It was their friends, their families. It was the water they were all drinking. Davidson saw the tide turn against him. He saw the cold, prosecutorial gleam in Agent Thompson's eye. He saw the faces of the crowd, twisted with hatred. He was trapped. He did the only thing a cornered rat could do. He drew his pistol, but he never had a chance to fire it. Two shots rang out, almost as one. One came from Frank Morrison, the lawman, who had finally chosen a side. The other came from Samuel Bear Morrison, the protector, who had made a promise to a family. Marshall Davidson fell to the dusty street, the conspiracy dying with him. The aftermath was swift. The federal investigation, armed with Garrett's evidence, tore through the territorial government like a wildfire. The governor, company executives, corrupt officials, they were all arrested. The trials became national news, leading to the first real federal laws protecting workers and the environment. But for Bear, the real victory was quieter. It was watching Thomas take his first shaky breaths without coughing. It was seeing the light and intelligence return to Mary's eyes as her body healed. It was seeing Catherine and Rebecca finally sleep through the night, knowing they were safe. The compensation fund established by the government provided for the children's future. But they didn't need money. They needed a family. One afternoon, as the children were finally well enough to leave the clinic, Rebecca asked the question that had been hanging in the air for weeks. "What happens to us now, Mr. Morrison?" Bear looked at the four children who had completely dismantled his life and then rebuilt it into something stronger, something better. He had arrived in Deadwood Junction, a ghost, a man running from the past. He wasn't running anymore. "I'm not a father," he said, his voice thick. "I don't know the first thing about raising kids." "We're not asking you to be our father," Rebecca said gently. "He's gone. We're asking you to be our family. You already are." And in that moment, the last wall around Bear Morrison's heart crumbled to dust. "Yes," he said. "We're a family, and families stay together." He bought a small plot of land outside of town, and with the help of his brother Frank, who had taken a job as head of security for the new expanded hospital, he built a home. It wasn't a fancy house, but it was strong, and it was safe, and it was filled with the sound of laughter. Rebecca started studying to be a teacher. Mary discovered a passion for science. Catherine decided she would be a doctor, just like Dr. Harper. And Thomas? Thomas just got to be a little boy. One evening, as the sun set over the Black Hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Bear stood on the porch of his new home, watching the children play. He had found four orphans who needed a protector, but in truth, they were the ones who had saved him. They had pulled him out of the grave he had dug for himself and taught him how to live again. He had learned that kindness isn't a currency to be spent. It's a seed. And if you plant it in the darkest of winters, sometimes, against all odds, it can grow into a home. If this story meant something to you, do us a favor and hit that like button. It tells YouTube that you want to see more stories just like this one. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the story we have for you next is one you are not going to want to miss. We'll see you in the next one.